Okay, let's unpack this. Look around. I mean, pay attention to the news, the conversations you're having. There's this pervasive sense, isn't there, that things aren't quite right.
Mm.
That liberal democracy, the system so many of us have lived under and maybe, taken for granted, feels, well, brittle.
Mm.
Like it's facing a real crisis.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm.
We're seeing trust in institutions just erode kind of globally. Politics feels incredibly polarized, unstable.
Right.
And you see the rise of, well, authoritarian populism figures like Trump, Le Pen, Bolsonaro, Modi, and then there's the whole backdrop of countries like Russia and China. The future, the very idea of liberal democracy, feels genuinely uncertain right now.
And what's fascinating and maybe a bit frustrating is that there is this hunger for change. People sense that change is all but inevitable.
Yeah, you feel it.
But when you look at the solutions being talked about, and there are lots of interesting ones, citizens' assemblies, UBI, that kind of thing, there's a feeling that they're a bit disconnected.
Mm-hmm. Ad hoc, maybe?
Yeah, like we're grabbing for tools without having a really coherent plan, without a shared vision of the just society we're actually trying to build.
Exactly. And that's precisely the problem Daniel Chandler tackles head-on in his book, Free and Equal. He argues we've kind of lost our way because we stopped thinking about the fundamental questions. We need to go back to first principles, grapple with what justice really requires of us today.
And his big idea, the core of the book, is that the work of one specific philosopher offers us an unparalleled and as yet untapped intellectual resource to do just that. He means John Rawls.
Yes. Chandler makes a really powerful case that Rawls' ideas provide that missing map, that framework we need to guide us.
So our mission in this deep dive is to explore Chandler's argument in Free and Equal. We're going to dive into Rawls' key concepts, see how they diagnose the issues we face today, and crucially, look at the surprising ways they can point us towards concrete solutions for building a society that is genuinely free and equal. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. So first off, John Rawls himself. Even if the name isn't instantly familiar, his impact on political philosophy is just monumental.
Right.
Chandler puts him right in the top tier, saying his place in the canon is universally accepted, alongside names like Plato, Hobbes, Adam Smith, Marx. And his book from 1971, A Theory of Justice, it didn't just contribute, it actually revolutionized political philosophy.
Wow, revolutionized it. So what was his big goal? What was he actually trying to achieve with that?
He was trying to articulate a vision for what he called a realistic utopia. So not some impossible dream, right?
Yeah.
But the best that a democratic society could be under the, constraints of the real world. His core genius, really, was finding a way to bridge this really old divide in political thought.
Which was?
Between classical liberalism focusing on individual freedoms and socialism often prioritizing equality.
Yeah.
Rawls built a philosophy deeply committed to both freedom and equality at the deepest level.
So it's like saying you don't have to choose. You can have really robust individual liberty and profound equality.
Precisely. And Chandler presents this as a much-needed alternative to the harsh neoliberalism that dominates our political discourse, that idea that efficiency and individual market outcomes are kind of all that matter. Rawls offers a framework for a truly humane and egalitarian liberalism.
Where did that drive come from for him personally? Was there something specific?
Well, the book touches on his experiences in World War II. Witnessing the scale of human atrocity, particularly learning about the Holocaust, apparently led him to what's described as a profound crisis of faith. He'd actually considered becoming a minister, but that just became impossible for him. He returned to philosophy, grappling with this really fundamental question. If you can't ground justice in God or some, ultimate moral truth, what can you ground it in? What exactly does justice require of us? And is it even possible to build such a society?
It feels almost tragically timed then that his ideas gained dominance in philosophy just as the political world was shifting into the Reagan-Thatcher era, which was so focused on individualism and markets, wasn't it?
It is deeply ironic.
Yeah.
Chandler notes this timing sometimes led to misunderstandings, people mistakenly seeing his work as defending the status quo. But Rawls wasn't looking backwards. He was laying out a vision for a society far more just than the one he saw around him.
Okay, before we get to that full vision, we need to wrap our heads around a couple of his foundational concepts. One is political liberalism. What does that mean, sort of, in practice?
Well, think about how diverse modern societies are. We have vastly different religious beliefs, moral philosophies, ideas about the good life, right?
Sure.
Historically, many political systems tried to build society around one of those comprehensive views. Rawls said that's just a non-starter in a diverse democracy. Political liberalism is the idea that the core principles of justice that govern our shared public life, things like voting, basic rights, the legal system, should be freestanding of any comprehensive moral doctrine.
So it's not saying your personal morals or religion don't matter to you, but that the rules of the road for everyone shouldn't depend on everyone sharing your specific personal beliefs. Is that it?
Exactly right. The goal is to find principles of justice that are justifiable using ideas and reasons that most citizens can share, regardless of their deeper personal philosophies. This is, I think, incredibly relevant for navigating the culture wars we see today.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's about finding a basis for political agreement and cooperation without demanding everyone convert to the same worldview.
That makes a lot of sense. And the other really famous and maybe often misunderstood concept is the original position. What's this thought experiment really trying to do?
It's basically a device to help us think clearly about fairness.
Hmm.
Imagine you're deciding the basic rules of society, but you're behind what Rawls called a veil of ignorance.
Okay.
You don't know if you're rich or poor, male or female, what race you are, how smart or strong you are, or even what kind of life you'll want to lead. What principles would you choose if you had to design society without knowing where you'd end up in it?
And this isn't meant to be like a literal historical event or some kind of actual meeting.
No, absolutely not. Chandler really stresses it's a device for public reflection and self-clarification. Its power comes from the fact that the setup itself, the veil of ignorance, builds in ideas about fairness that we already intuitively accept.
Like what?
Like, well, everyone's interests should count equally, right? And you shouldn't design rules just to benefit people like you. It helps us identify the principles we have internal reasons to support because they align with our deepest sense of fairness.
Okay, so this thought experiment, the original position, it leads Rawls to propose two main principles of justice. How do they stack up? Is there an order?
Yes, Rawls argued they have a specific priority. The first principle, which guarantees basic liberties, has priority over the second principle, which concerns social and economic inequalities.
Meaning?
It means you can't trade away fundamental freedoms like the right to speak your mind or practice your religion just for the sake of, say, making everyone economically equal or making society more efficient overall. Liberties come first.
Got it. Liberties first. Let's dig into that first principle then. The basic liberties. What kind of fundamental freedoms are we talking about here?
Chandler breaks them down quite neatly. You've got personal liberties. Things like freedom of conscience, thought, expression, association, your bodily integrity,
Right.
private and family life, even things like sexuality and reproduction and owning personal property. These basically carve out a protected space for you to live your life as you see fit.
Well, yeah.
Then there are political liberties, voting, running for office, and procedural liberties like the rule of law. Hugely important.
And a really important point here you mentioned is that he gives equal weight to personal and political freedoms. That wasn't always the case, right?
No, exactly. This is key. Historically, some thinkers emphasize the liberties of the moderns, like freedom from state interference, conscience, private life, associated with Locke, maybe, while others emphasize the liberties of the ancients, like the freedom to participate in politics, voting, deliberation, more Rousseau. Rawls saw both as basic and equally essential.
So if you overemphasize the political freedom side, you could get what?
Well, the danger is the tyranny of the majority. Chandler uses the example of leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who might appeal to majority sentiment to justify discriminating against minorities, say LGBTQ+ individuals. Rawls' framework pushes back hard against that. Basic rights aren't subject to a simple majority vote, they're fundamental.
You also mentioned a shift in how we think about applying these liberties from vertical to horizontal. What does that mean for how these freedoms clash in practice day to day?
Yeah, vertical was the kind of traditional focus, protecting individuals from the state, think criticizing the government or securing abortion rights against state bans.
Okay.
But increasingly, the conflicts are horizontal, how our freedom impacts the freedom of other people, other citizens, or non-state groups.
So like debates about protesters blocking access to clinics, maybe? Or parents wanting to pull kids from certain school lessons, the LGBTQ+ issues. It's one person's freedom bumping up against another's.
Exactly that. And Rawls's framework provides a basis for navigating those really complex horizontal conflicts, always coming back to the idea that everyone's basic liberties must be secured, not just your own preferred ones.
Free speech is obviously a huge flashpoint today.
Mm.
How does Rawls help us think about where the line should be drawn?
Well, the book points out that Rawls's principle definitely supports banning dangerous speech, speech that directly incites violence. That's
Oh.
pretty clear.
Right.
But, and this is important, it does not extend to banning speech simply because it's offensive, insulting, and degrading, which is sometimes included in broader hate speech laws you see in some places. So you can legally prevent harassment or direct incitement, absolutely, but not necessarily just saying hateful things online, for instance, even if they're morally abhorrent. There's a distinction there.
That's a really sharp line between dangerous speech and offensive speech.
Yeah.
What about the way we talk about things, though? The tone.
Yeah, that's where the moral aspect comes in, not the legal one. Rawls talks about a duty of civility, specifically in the public political forum.
A duty of civility.
Yes, not a law, but a moral expectation, especially for public officials and maybe for all of us when we're deciding who to vote for. It's the idea that we should try to justify our political positions using public reasons based on values and evidence that most citizens could reasonably accept, rather than just appealing to our personal religion or our specific moral code. It asks us to step outside our own bubble.
When we're talking about shared public life, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, moving from the principles to the structures, how important is constitutional design in actually safeguarding these liberties?
Oh, it's crucial. Constitutions are key because they protect these basic freedoms from being easily undone by temporary political majorities. Chandler frames this not as anti-democratic, but as acknowledging different levels of democratic decision-making. The Constitution represents the people's will at a deeper, more fundamental level than just ordinary laws passed by a simple majority.
And how should a good constitution be set up? What makes it work?
Well, the idea is it needs to be hard but not impossible to change. You need stability for basic rights, definitely, but also the ability to adapt as society changes.
Right, a balance.
Exactly. The book contrasts the UK's flexibility, maybe sometimes instability, with the difficulty of amending the US Constitution or Germany's very strong entrenchment of core principles. You need mechanisms for clarifying and updating its meaning over time.
And the courts play a massive role in that, presumably.
Vital, yeah. An independent judiciary is absolutely essential for an effective constitution. Chandler points to the U.S. as a salutary warning, a cautionary tale, about what happens with excessive politicization of judicial appointments,
Yeah.
where judges are increasingly seen as partisan actors rather than neutral interpreters of the law. He notes other models, like judicial councils used elsewhere, that aim for more insulation from that kind of political pressure.
So it sounds like you can have the perfect rules written down, but if the culture isn't right, it still falls apart.
Exactly. That's a huge point. Beyond the legal structures, liberal democracy depends on citizens who actually share certain basic political values. People who are reasonable, tolerant, willing to compromise, and committed to finding those public reasons we talked about.
And is that culture strong enough?
Well, the source highlights some concerning trends, actually, showing declining support for these values, especially among younger generations, and a worrying openness to non-democratic alternatives like technocracy or even military rule in some surveys. It's a reminder that a just society isn't just built. It requires ongoing civic engagement and a shared commitment from its citizens.
Okay, let's shift gears then to the second principle. This one gets into social and economic inequality. You mentioned the job analogy earlier. Let's use that again to explain the two parts: fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle.
Right, okay. So imagine all the different jobs in society, cleaner, doctor, architect, whatever, with different levels of pay and prestige. Fair equality of opportunity is about ensuring everyone has a truly equal chance to compete for those jobs, no matter where they started in life, who their parents were.
Okay, level playing field to get the job?
Exactly. Then the difference principle comes after that. It asks whether the structure of society itself, the way those jobs and their rewards are organized, is fair. And it judges that fairness specifically by whether the resulting inequalities benefit the least well-off members of society the most.
Got it. Equal chance to get in the race, and then judging the race's outcomes by how they affect the runners lagging at the back. So fair equality of opportunity first. What's the ultimate goal there?
The goal is that your life chances are not determined by the sheer luck of birth, who your parents are, where you grew up. It's about genuinely giving everyone something like the same starting line, as much as possible.
And what's key to achieving that in practice? What policies help?
Education is just foundational here. The book strongly argues for universal early years education, highlighting the massive benefits, especially for disadvantaged kids. School funding needs to use weighted funding formulas to direct more resources to schools and students who need it most.
Right.
And access to higher education should genuinely be based on ability rather than on ability to pay. That's crucial.
But the reality often feels very, very different, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It does. The source points to the persistent reality of sticky floors and ceilings. Kids from wealthy backgrounds tend to stay wealthy. Kids from poor backgrounds really struggle to move up. And there's what sociologists call opportunity hoarding, where the wealthy use their resources, networks, internships, tutoring to give their kids an extra edge.
Yeah.
That stark statistic that elite universities often have more students from the top 1% than the entire bottom 50%, that's a powerful example of opportunity hoarding in action.
So how do we tackle these systemic injustices, especially when they intersect with things like race and gender? Let's start with race.
Okay, when it comes to race, the source is very clear. You absolutely have to address the legacy of outright exploitation and oppression. It's not enough to just say, we're not discriminating now.
So what does that involve?
It requires a multi-pronged approach. Robust anti-discrimination laws, yes. Potentially affirmative action where necessary, the book suggests. Plus, policies that directly sever the link between poverty and life chances. Things like universal early education we mentioned, targeted school funding, making higher education genuinely affordable.
So it's not just hoping colorblind policies will eventually fix it. You need targeted action.
No. The source argues quite strongly for complementing race-neutral policies with targeted, race-conscious investments, especially in communities with histories of segregation and disinvestment. That means significant public investment in disadvantaged neighborhoods, better schools, affordable housing, public safety, job opportunities. The evidence of persistent racial bias in things like hiring, that famous Bertrand and Mullainathan study sending out identical resumes, shows why just banning discrimination isn't enough on its own.
Okay. And what about for gender inequality?
Well, overt discrimination is probably less common than it was, but issues like sexual harassment remain significant. And crucially, the source highlights the gendered division of labor within the home as a key driver of inequality.
The fact that women still do most of the unpaid care work.
Exactly, leading to the well-documented child penalty in their wages and career progression after having children.
And the argument isn't just that this happens, but that even if these feel like individual choices, they're not truly free choices if they're made in a fundamentally unequal context.
Precisely. The source challenges the idea that because women aren't explicitly forced into these roles, it's automatically fair. It argues it's not fair if those choices are heavily shaped by ongoing discrimination, rigid social norms about gender roles, and a lack of adequate support structures like affordable childcare or parental leave.
So what kind of policies can help?
Policies like robust parental leave schemes that genuinely encourage fathers to take substantial leave are proposed. The aim isn't to dictate how families organize themselves, but to loosen those rigid gender norms and create more equal contexts for making those choices.
Okay, let's move to the second part of that second principle, the difference principle. Why did Rawls think this specific approach, judging inequalities by whether they benefit the least well off, was the right way to think about economic outcomes? Why not just aim for, say, the highest average income for everyone or something like that?
He argued it embodies a really powerful ideal of reciprocity. It's the idea that in a truly just society, we should be able to face one another openly and justify the basic structure of society, particularly to those who have the least. It says we can only accept inequalities if they can be shown to work to the greatest possible benefit of the least advantaged group.
That seems very different from a purely utilitarian view.
Oh, completely. Utilitarianism might say it's okay for some people to be very poor if it somehow maximizes the total happiness or wealth in society. Rawls rejects that. He says you can't ask the poor to sacrifice for the sake of the richer. The source notes this focus on reciprocity is actually supported by research in moral psychology and might even have deep roots in human evolution, this sense of fairness and mutual justification.
That idea of justifying the system to the person doing the worst, that strikes me as incredibly powerful, morally.
It is. And crucially, the difference principle looks beyond just money, beyond just income and wealth. Chandler really emphasizes this point. Neoliberalism often focuses almost solely on income and wealth inequality.
Yeah, GDP growth,
Yeah.
income levels.
But Rawls has a much broader and more humane perspective. He recognizes that people also care deeply about other things, like being in charge of their own lives, having meaningful work, feeling a sense of dignity, and perhaps most importantly of all, self-respect.
Self-respect is called out in the book as the most important primary good. What exactly does that mean in this context? How does Rawls define it?
It's defined as having confidence that your goals in life are worthwhile and in your ability to achieve them. It's sort of foundational to everything else, to pursuing any plan of life.
And how does that connect to work?
Well, the source links this to the Aristotelian principle. It's not Aristotle's term exactly, but Rawls uses it. The idea that people feel their life is valuable when they can develop and use their skills and talents in interesting and complex ways. This is why paid work takes on special importance. It's not just about the income, though that matters, but the contribution, the sense of purpose, the feeling of reciprocity in society. It speaks directly to that feeling of being left behind or undervalued that seems to drive some of the discontent we talked about right at the start.
Right, that lack of dignity or meaning. Okay, so if that's the vision, a society grounded in these principles, liberties, fair opportunity, and outcomes that benefit the least well-off, fostering self-respect, how does Chandler translate this Rawlsian framework into concrete policy ideas for today's world?
Well, he argues pretty strongly it demands far-reaching reform of our current economic system, a real move away from that harsh and individualistic neoliberalism we mentioned. The goal isn't just to make the economy bigger or more efficient in some abstract sense, but to make it fundamentally fair.
And this brings up the concept of pre-distribution versus redistribution. Can you unpack that?
Yeah. So redistribution is the familiar idea of fixing inequality after market incomes are earned using taxes and benefits, right?
Yep.
Pre-distribution focuses on tackling inequality at the source, looking at how market incomes are generated in the first place. Chandler uses the comparison between countries like Denmark, which has a much lower pre-tax income inequality than the US or UK, to show that public policy can shape market outcomes significantly. Through things like accessible, high-quality education and training, regulating labor markets fairly, and crucially, strengthening workers' bargaining power relative to employers.
So what are some specific policies suggested for empowering workers and making the labor market more just based on these principles?
Well, raising the minimum wage is presented as one direct tool that disproportionately benefits the least well-off. The source cites evidence like David Card's work and reviews by R. Dubé, suggesting you can raise minimum wages quite significantly in many places with only modest, if any, negative impact on employment levels.
Interesting. What else?
Strengthening trade unions is another key way to give workers more collective bargaining power. And addressing involuntary unemployment is seen as crucial because lacking long-term security is just devastating to self-respect and your sense of belonging. The idea of the state potentially acting as an employer of last resort is even floated as a possibility to guarantee work for those who want it.
Universal Basic Income, UBI, comes up as well, often as an alternative to the traditional welfare state. How does that fit in?
It does. UBI, a regular unconditional payment to everyone, is presented as a way to provide a basic safety net without the complexity, stigma, and often demeaning nature of means-tested benefits. It provides, as Chandler puts it, a floor on which they can all safely stand, supporting independence and self-respect.
And it might change power dynamics.
Potentially, yes. It could fundamentally alter the balance of power at work, acting almost like a permanent strike fund, giving workers more leverage to refuse poor conditions or low pay. While there are always concerns that some people might stop working, the source suggests the evidence indicates this is unlikely to be a major effect, and the benefits in terms of dignity, security, and potentially entrepreneurship could be significant. Funding could come from progressive taxes or maybe even a citizens' wealth fund, like in Alaska.
And then there's the more radical idea of workplace democracy. What's the argument there?
The argument, quite starkly, is that the typical structure of the capitalist workplace, where shareholders hold ultimate power and control, is deeply unjust from a Rawlsian perspective. It undermines reciprocity and self-respect for many workers, so Chandler explores alternatives.
Like what?
One is co-management or co-determination, which is actually quite common in places like Germany. Workers elect representatives to sit on company boards alongside shareholder representatives.
Giving them a real voice.
Exactly. It breaks the exclusive grip that shareholders have on decision-making and gives workers a say in the strategic direction of the company. The book suggests aiming for a maximal model with equal or nearly equal worker power on boards, citing evidence that it doesn't seem to significantly hurt productivity or growth.
And taking it even further, there are worker cooperatives.
Yeah, this is where the workers are the owners, typically operating on a one worker, one vote basis, either directly or through elected representatives. It directly addresses the fundamental power imbalance.
Are they viable?
Well, raising external investment can be a challenge compared to traditional firms. But successful, large-scale models like the Mondragon Corporation in Spain or the Lega Cooperative Federations in Italy show how this can be overcome through things like cooperative banking networks and strong support federations. It's not just a fringe idea.
Okay, funding all of this, especially things like UBI or major public investments, requires taxation. How does a Rawlsian framework approach that? Does it just see tax as a necessary evil?
Not at all. It fundamentally challenges the common narrative that taxes are bad for growth. The source cites research like Peter Lindert's work on the free lunch puzzle or IMF studies, suggesting that higher taxes and redistribution don't necessarily harm economic growth and might even help it in some cases.
So the focus shifts.
Yes. From a Rawlsian perspective, the priority isn't just the size of the total economic pie, but ensuring the slice going to the least well-off is as large as absolutely possible, and that any inequalities genuinely work to their greatest benefit. So, taxation is a crucial tool for achieving justice, not just funding services.
What kinds of taxes?
Progressive income taxes are obviously key. Consumption taxes, like VAT or carbon taxes, need to be assessed in the round. You have to consider their impact on the poor, but also how the revenue is used, maybe through rebates or targeted spending. And crucially, wealth taxation is seen as essential and often overlooked.
Wealth tax, that's always a lightning rod politically, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. But the book argues it's necessary. It proposes steeply progressive inheritance taxes and potentially taxes on large lifetime gift receipts to tackle intergenerational inequality and the concentration of wealth and power. Annual wealth taxes on large fortunes are also discussed as a potential tool, though politically difficult, for funding a just society and limiting the undue influence that vast wealth can bring.
So that's a really comprehensive sweep of potential economic reforms grounded in Rawls. But what about fixing democracy itself? The source highlights how unhappy people are not just with outcomes, but with the process of democracy.
Absolutely. That survey finding you mentioned earlier, that fewer than a third of people felt their elected reps actually cared about them, that's really stark. And it's clearly tied to the problem of unequal political influence.
Where the wealthy get their way.
Yeah, the wealthy and powerful interest groups often dominate policymaking, while the preferences of average citizens, as studies like that famous Julins and Page 1 in the U.S. showed, seem to have almost no impact on what actually happens. That feels fundamentally unjust and undermines the whole idea of democracy.
So how can we make the mechanics of elections work better to address that imbalance?
Well, while electoral democracy definitely has its flaws, the source argues it still has decisive advantages over other systems if it's designed well, if it genuinely ensures equal votes and reasonably equal opportunities for political influence.
Does it matter how we vote? Like first past the post versus PR?
Yes, there's a discussion comparing systems. It contrasts first past the post, used in the UK and US, with proportional representation, which is actually used by the majority of established democracies. PR generally leads to better representation of diverse views, though sometimes raises questions about accountability. Ways to improve PR are mentioned, like using open lists so voters choose candidates, or having smaller districts to maintain a local link.
And what about dealing with the corrosive effect of money in politics? That seems key to leveling the playing field.
Totally. Public campaign funding is suggested as a major reform, things like democracy vouchers, where citizens get funds to donate to candidates, or citizens' budgets for campaigns. The goal is to reduce the dependence of politicians on wealthy donors and corporate interests.
The media is also called out as critical infrastructure for a healthy democracy, and it seems to be in crisis too.
Right. You see the financial collapse of traditional public interest journalism, the worrying decline of local news, which studies link to increased corruption and lower voter turnout. These are serious threats to an informed citizenry.
What are the proposed solutions there?
A couple of models are discussed. One is direct state funding for public media, like the BBC model, but with strong safeguards for independence, high standards, and internal pluralism. Another idea is media vouchers, similar to the campaign finance idea, where citizens could direct public funds to news outlets they trust, fostering external pluralism and a variety of voices, while still potentially requiring adherence to certain journalistic standards.
And what about bringing citizens in more directly, beyond just voting, through participatory democracy?
Yeah, exploring models like participatory budgeting, where citizens get to directly decide how a portion of public money is spent in their local area. The example of Porto Alegre in Brazil is often cited as a success story, and it's spread globally.
What makes those work?
Key factors seem to be ensuring the participants are actually representative of the community, incorporating expert information effectively, and crucially, handing over real decision-making power, not just making it an advisory talking shop. The book suggests expanding these kinds of initiatives, particularly at local levels, which would require more decentralization of power from central government.
Yeah, okay, so we have this powerful vision from Rawls translated into these really concrete policy ideas by Chandler across economics and politics. But the book doesn't just lay out the ideal. It gets real about the challenges and the strategy for actually getting there, right?
Yes, absolutely. Chandler is very realistic about the inevitable resistance from entrenched elites who benefit from the status quo. But he pushes back hard against fatalism, arguing that what is politically achievable is not predetermined. It depends on what people believe in and are willing to fight for. Agency matters.
So political strategy becomes immensely important then. What's the advice there?
The argument is that progressive movements and parties need to lead rather than to follow. They need to make a fundamentally moral argument for their vision of a just society, not just tinker around the edges.
But isn't there a danger of being too radical and facing electoral oblivion?
He acknowledges that pitfall. Yes, you can't ignore political reality, but equally he rejects the assumption that constant moderation is the only viable path. He points to global survey data showing a really significant appetite for major reforms or even completely overhauled systems in many countries. People are ready for substantial change, maybe more than elites realize.
And building broad coalitions is obviously part of any winning strategy. How does identity politics fit in?
It's addressed directly. Identity-based organizing has been absolutely vital for minorities fighting for justice, no question. But the source warns against it becoming so exclusive that it hinders the formation of wider coalitions needed for systemic change.
How so?
It pushes back against the idea that identity is the only legitimate basis for political authority, or that people from different groups are merely allies rather than fellow citizens with potentially shared political interests grounded in broader principles of justice. It also counters the common media narrative that progressive stances on identity issues automatically alienate working-class voters.
Oh, interesting. What's the evidence on that?
The source presents evidence suggesting this narrative is often overblown. The working class is incredibly diverse, many hold liberal social views, and analysis shows most former center-left voters haven't actually switched to the far right, but have often become non-voters. The argument is the focus should be on building coalitions around shared political values, fairness, and equality, which can unite diverse groups.
Stepping back for a moment, what's the ultimate relationship here between philosophy, like Rawls's complex work, and the messy, practical business of politics?
Chandler's really clear on this distinction. Rawls, and philosophy more broadly, gives us the compass, the vision of what we should be aiming for as a society. That's philosophy's job, clarifying the ends, how we can get there, navigating the political realities, building coalitions, designing specific policies. That's the job of politics and social science, figuring out the means. So Rawls isn't offering a ready-made political program, but a vital intellectual resource to clarify the goal, to give us the language and the framework to articulate that vision for a more just future.
And finally, how does this whole framework, particularly Rawls' idea of political liberalism that we started with, help us navigate some of the most difficult, divisive debates we face today, like the so-called culture wars?
That's where it can be incredibly powerful, I think. It offers a way to move away from framing these often intractable debates as a zero-sum battle for moral supremacy, where one side tries to impose its deepest comprehensive beliefs, religious or secular, on everyone else.
Okay, so instead of that battle.
Instead, the focus shifts to respecting each other's basic freedom to live according to our own comprehensive beliefs, whatever they are, and agreeing not to use the coercive power of the state to enforce any single one of those views on everyone. It's about finding terms of cooperation based on mutual respect for liberty.
So applying this to really contentious debates like reproductive rights or LGBTQ+ rights, Wouldn't be about arguing from a specific religious text or a particular moral code about sin.
No. According to this approach, it's about grounding the argument in something more foundational. Quote, our fundamental right to live according to our own beliefs and the equal rights of all citizens. This is a principle that everyone in a diverse society, regardless of their personal morality, has a reason to accept if they want their own freedom protected. Chandler suggests this approach makes these incredibly difficult debates less existential, less of an all-or-nothing fight for ultimate truth, and offers perhaps the most promising path to finding common ground on basic rights in a pluralistic society.
Wow. Okay. This deep dive into Daniel Chandler's Free and Equal and his exploration of John Rawls's ideas has really taken us on quite a journey. From the philosophical bedrock of what justice even means, right through to concrete policy proposals for our economy and our democracy, and even tackling the hard questions of political change. It really does offer a robust framework for thinking about how to build a society that genuinely values both freedom and equality.
It really does. And it feels like more than just abstract ideas, doesn't it? It feels like it gives us a potential destination, a clearer direction, and maybe the intellectual tools and language to articulate a compelling vision for a better future. Something that directly addresses that feeling of discontent and uncertainty that so many people seem to feel today.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. What might our political conversations actually look like if, instead of constantly trying to win a battle for moral supremacy, we consistently try to appeal to principles that everyone, whatever their deeper beliefs, could accept as fair? What would you be willing to fight for to build a society based on genuine freedom and equality for all?